I think the virtues of a good master, the 12 virtues, the work by Brother Agathon, gives us an insight into the Lasallian schools 105 years after the first school in Reims. For this reason, we're able to judge how has this Lasallian heritage been passed on, because the most perceptive French historians, I think, see that de La Salle succeeded where his predecessors failed to establish good schools for the poor. And I think we need to ask the question, why did he succeed? And the historians say, well, because he created a movement. And I see Agathon's 12 virtues as a very interesting landmark in this kind of movement that was launched. Brother Agathon's trying to give us a profile of the ideal kind of teacher. He's an 18th century man, so he's very much into the neoclassical ideas of the period, which come very much through the Greeks and the Latins, that virtues, for example, can be acquired by practicing the thing often enough, by developing habits. So that these 12 virtues offer us a kind of profile of where a teacher begins and how he succeeds in becoming a better kind of teacher. Brother Agathon was born in 1731 and died in 1798. We know that he came into the brothers' congregation following his older brother. We don't know very much about where he was trained or how he was trained, but we find him as the author of a text on mathematics, a book on commerce, we'd call it today a book on bookkeeping, and we know that at one period of his life he taught the science of navigation to French naval officers in the brothers' school in Vannes. He was called to the general chapter of 1777, not because he was a delegate. There were only 30 delegates, and he was not a very prominent person. But he was known to be clear-headed and a very good person at summarizing things. He came to the chapter as secretary, and I think to his great surprise, found himself elected superior general. He then endured the period of the French Revolution, appeared before the Assembly twice in Paris to defend the Institute, to try and save it, spent 18 months in prison, and eventually died in exile after the dispersion of the congregation in 1798. The Brother Agathon wrote the 12 Virtues of a Good Master as a circular letter to the brothers. He had it printed because he began the tradition of printing circulars rather than having them copied from community to community. Possibly he found there were certain errors creeping into these circulars. We don't know why, but he began a tradition which continues to the present day. The 12 Virtues came as the second circular of his period of office. The first one had been addressed to the brothers in terms of their religious duties, and he begins the second circular by saying there wouldn't be much point in talking about our religious duties unless we talked about the main reason why we exist as a brotherhood, as a congregation, namely for the Christian education of the poor. The listing of the virtues and the development comes nevertheless out of Lasallian writings. It shows somebody who's absorbed de La Salle's ideas, but is not simply repeating them in a literal way, but is able to adapt them. I think if we're looking today at a Lasallian heritage about teaching, I mean, is there a recognizable profile of a good Lasallian teacher, then I think this work is a very good guide for us. Well, I think gravity, or what we'd call seriousness, is the first virtue because it's the basis of the relationship that a new teacher has to establish with his pupils. He's going to take them seriously, but they must take him seriously as well. I think the aim of the teacher, Agathon says expressly, is to win their affection, so that this is not standoffishness, we'd say, or distance from the pupils at all, but something which means that a relationship is gradually created rather than simply imposed. In all of these virtues, Agathon, trying to place virtue always in the middle, neither by an excess or a defect, following the classical method, will state what the virtue is to be, but he'll then show the things that it's not to be. So that he says if seriousness is not meant to be distance from pupils, because he says expressly the aim is to win their affection, and therefore he's to show kindness. But he does this from a position of being a teacher, and not by getting so close to them and trying to be one of them, as it were, that he loses their actual respect. I think the question of silence has to be approached first of all from the viewpoint of a 17th or 18th century man and the kind of classrooms that existed at that time. De La Salle's insistence that if the teacher speaks much, then the pupils speak a great deal, etc. But if you save the voice and you reserve the voice for privileged moments when you speak from the heart to the heart, then you're going to be better listened to. And it's interesting that we find this idea twice in Lasallian heritage. For example, the idea of the reflection. The reflection is given daily. The reflection is something of about 3 minutes where the teacher speaks from the heart to the hearts of the pupils, to try and touch their hearts, that famous Lasallian expression. I think modern pedagogy perhaps is rediscovering the importance of silence, because classrooms shouldn't be about teachers teaching. They should be much more about pupils learning. I think the idea of humility is an idea that's difficult for us to accept today. And it's interesting that Brother Agathon frames humility, the third virtue, in the context of becoming like little children. Jesus says, unless you become like little children, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. I think we find it hard because we sometimes think of humility as some kind of untruthful self-abasement, a kind of professional Uriah Heep in David Copperfield. But that's not Agathon's view at all. His idea is rather to communicate to the children that you enjoy this task of being with little children, of instructing children. Remember, he's talking about primary and what we'd call upper primary children, so he's using the word children, not students. He's suggesting also that he must be able to receive these children with kindness and gentleness. The very word receiving suggests to me the teacher, the adult, and the smaller child coming and the bending down and listening, and being able to accommodate himself to it, to understand what the question is, and to reply, he says, with kindness and gentleness. And then, because virtue must always remain in the middle, neither by excess nor defect, he says, never with insulting, scornful, or disdainful airs. I find that a very wonderful description of a teacher who is approachable. A prudent teacher, I think, is one who will not simply accept his class as the same as the last class that he had. He will see this class as composed of individuals, and their genius or character, to use Agathon's words, need to be studied. So some pupils are slow and need to be taken along more gently. Some perhaps see things more quickly, and they should be encouraged to move more quickly. But you don't treat them all the same way, and you don't treat every class as though all children are exactly the same. That's why I think when he talks about training minds and hearts, that's the general aim, but he's to train the particular minds and hearts according to the genius or character of each pupil. I think prudence overflows fairly naturally into wisdom. Indeed, at the beginning of the treatise, Agathon wonders whether he shouldn't start with wisdom as the one virtue that incorporates all the others. But he eventually says, no, we'll follow the order that de La Salle gave us, because he must have had some reason. I think we've always seen in the perhaps Western tradition anyhow, and perhaps equally in the Eastern, in the Asian tradition, that wisdom is something usually associated with elders. Now, most of us may not feel we've reached necessarily that stage of being gurus for others, but we are older people. We've all been young people in school. We've all been adolescents. I think we've learnt something from that. We survived it ourselves. We have to remember sometimes that that's where those young people are. And sometimes we even notice things that are happening. Sometimes, instead of waiting for outbursts and explosions in classrooms, I think the wise teacher is the one who can sometimes find the consoling word, or perhaps just the private moment, to actually help a pupil through what may be a very difficult moment in his or her life. I find the treatment of patience that Brother Agathon makes in the treatise very practical. I made this point before, but this is not a philosophical consideration. When he comes to deal with patience, he shows you, and he gives you a whole long list of the various defects that you're going to find in the pupils whom you teach. And you're going to suffer from these things. And he sees patience as the way in which you recognize these defects, and by being patient, by being tolerant, but also by being firm, you gradually bring these pupils to a stage where, as he says, the virtue creeps into their soul. You may not have seen this happen with your pupils yet, but he sees that this idea of patience is something that if you keep with the pupils, you keep encouraging, you keep the relationship open, you don't simply bar them because of things like that, you always show yourself open in that relationship, then he says you will draw the fruits of your patience in the better conduct, better behavior of your pupils. When we come to the virtue of what I've called reserve, or we could also call discretion, because I think the two words are necessary to understand the fullness of what Agathon develops. I think he's thinking, first of all, very much as he has been in the earlier virtues, about silence and seriousness and so on like that. There's a certain reserve, a certain distance. But he says it's learning to be restrained when you could easily lose your temper, with justification. But you're restrained. You actually have a professional reserve with regard to pupils in this regard. That's one aspect of it. And then he turns it in a way that, sadly, we'll find only too relevant. He said it's also about care in friendship. Because you're going to be close to pupils and to young people, he said you have to be very careful not to actually develop friendships which can become dangerous or give wrong signals to kids. You must, he said, you must refrain from every dangerous attachment. He means favoring certain kinds of pupils. He actually gets very specific. He said, you mustn't touch them on the face. You mustn't caress them. You mustn't be willing to receive them, their embraces and things like that. Now, that strikes us as very forward, if you like, for an 18th century man. And I expect he's talking about something which was just as true in that society as true in our own. And that's the whole question of respecting the integrity of children, the innocence of children. If they show affection and things like that, then it's not to make use of it in your own way and in any way which would be unethical. I find this unusually explicit and probably justified by the kind of society in which Agathon lived and which we recognize also as a difficult in our own society. I think when Brother Agathon begins to talk about gentleness, he begins by remarking that gentleness wins for itself the friendship of the pupils. I find that interesting, that he talks about winning the friendship of pupils, not just their respect, not just their attention, but their friendship. And he says it wins their affection as well. And here, of course, we're following the whole tradition that de La Salle left of trying to touch the hearts of the pupils as one of the major ways of influencing their conduct, but also influencing their lives. Now, he comes to a remarkable sentence, which I think is really the heart of the whole treatise. And he says very simply, love is won by love. I think this is a very important concept, because he's not just saying a professional kind of air of gentleness. Pupils know they are actually loved in the broad sense of the word. And I think that gives rise then to a number of clear directives as to how this virtue of gentleness is to be cultivated. For example, you must try and avoid the defects. If you're talking to pupils about avoiding coarse manners and coarse language and things like that, you must model it yourself. That must be part of your gentleness to them. You actually are gentle to them, you trust them and esteem them so much that you're not prepared to offer any kind of undignified, unbecoming behavior in their presence. That shows genuine respect and love for them. He brings in other things which we'd expect from that 18th century, order, policy, etc. But he said it's not to be stern and irksome. It's not discipline for its own sake. Not to be a kind of prison discipline. How's this going to be achieved? Well, he says by showing equal kindness to all. Sure, we've all learnt this as teachers. There's to be no favoritism, no apples for the teacher. At the same time, it's to be gentle and at the same time vigilant. I find this an interesting kind of balance. So if it's gentle, it's not weak. Indeed, again and again, he will put gentleness and firmness side by side and say that this gentleness must also be firm. Pupils know that it's going to be firm. What he wants the teacher to avoid is any kind of language or conduct which he would call shocking or abusive, or language which is biting. I think the other side of that, if that's he shows us what to avoid, he says, pupils can make known their difficulties. I find that interesting. Now, when can pupils make known their difficulties to a teacher? When they trust him, when they know that they can ask a question, or perhaps even raise a question about something that is said, about perhaps a question of learning something, or perhaps about even some particular practice which is going to be commended to the class. If they feel they can make some kind of remonstrations with the teacher, then I think that says something about classroom climate. It's not surprising that Brother Agathon offers us the virtue of zeal as one of the virtues of a good teacher. After all, zeal is the secondary spirit of the Institute. First is the spirit of faith, and the second is this virtue of zeal. If we look at the French word says ardent. That's to say a burning zeal. Somebody who's on fire for the Christian education of these young people who are seen to be far from salvation. The development of the virtue then is very much in terms of teaching by good example, by sound instructions, and this word instruction in the Lasallian sense is always religious instruction, and thirdly, and this may surprise us, by wise and reasonable corrections. The zeal extends also towards wise and reasonable corrections. We mustn't think of corrections here simply as corrections of behavior. It means making sure that they spell correctly, that they speak correctly, that they write according to the correct method. All those things that are going to make them employable in this kind of harsh world for which they're destined at a very, very early age. When we come to vigilance or watchfulness, we come upon a metaphor which de La Salle uses frequently, and in particular in two of the meditations for the time of retreat. That's the idea that teachers are to be the guardian angels of their pupils. And the guardian angels, people always with them, accompanying them, watching over them perhaps. Unless this give us the idea of somebody who is suspicious and perhaps almost creates a kind of tense atmosphere in a classroom, Brother Agathon insists it's a vigilance without being assiduous, he said, distrustful, embarrassed, or guilty of unfounded conjectures. I love that last bit. Guilty of unfounded conjectures. You know, tell me what you're doing and don't do it. It's not that sort of a thing. It's rather watch over them, because so much of Lasallian correction, I think, is preventative. Piety as a virtue is something which is perhaps characterized by something in the exterior, conduct of a person. Brother Agathon will see it as a way of carrying out worthily our duties towards God. And he'd say that in this regard we do it because good example makes more impression on the minds of children than long discourses. So try and be as I am. Try and do what I do, rather than simply be subjected to what I tell you to do. I think piety in that sense also has the idea, in the original Latin sense and in the French, of devotedness. It's always a pious duty. The word often comes in that way. Piety is something that we show to other people because we ourselves are modeling the behavior that we'd like them to carry out. Yes, I think that you can't escape thinking about other Lasallian expressions when you take up the words like generosity. So that being with the children from morning until night, they may teach them those things that are necessary for a Christian life, for example. Or in one of the meditations on one of the saints who actually is martyred for the faith, de La Salle suggests you may not have to give your blood for the faith, but you have to be generous in giving your life to the service of these poor children. I think that's quite a challenge to the art of being a good teacher.